Today, it is my pleasure, on behalf of society, to welcome one of our members who will be presenting Australia's Food Parcel for Britain program, and the member is Gary Watson. If I may ask our Zoom master to please run Gary's story.
Gary Watson, one of our Australian members, escaped from law in 1979 and has been a professional philatelist ever since. He is best known internationally as owner of Prestige Philately, which has now been merged with Abacus Auctions, one of the most progressive firms in the world. Gary's father, Max, got him into stamps when he was only 4. He was a serious postmark collector from the age of 10. Over the past 40-plus years, he has formed world-class collections of Victorian date stamps, Ceylon during World War II, and aerograms of Eastern Arabia. However, his primary obsession is Australian mail to overseas destinations, from Federation in 1901 to the introduction of decimal currency in 1966. This started out as a bit of fun, seeking to acquire one attractive commercial item to every possible country, colony and flyspeck on the world map. However, almost inevitably, Gary found himself intrigued by routes, rates, and markings, creating a philatelic monster that is almost certainly the most extensive and important postal history collection of its type ever formed. Gary welcomes invitations to share his covers because it provides the impetus to properly write up his material. This is Gary's second Zoom display to our society, the first being Empire Airmail Scheme flights from Australia 1938 to 1939. After his presentation, Gary will be pleased to field questions from members.
Presenting Australia's Food Parcels for Britain program is our member, Gary Watson. Gary?
Thank you, Andrew. And whoever that was who read the introduction and pronounces philatelic. Might have to do something about that, fellas. Okay. A bit of background to what I'm going to be showing you. And firstly, I should say I appreciate the invitation from Andrew to do this presentation. And
thank you.
So many tuned in. I always wonder when I'm doing one of my presentations that people think, oh God, not him again, and very few tune in. But this is a good roundup, so I'm very pleased. Okay, the expression parcel post conjures up images of oversized articles, many of them dismembered, difficult to display, often more difficult to understand. Parcel post was always the black sheep of mail delivery, characterised as fourth-class mail, lower down the pecking order than newspapers. You may have noticed that by 2024, technology has all but done away with letters, postcards, and the mailing of periodicals. Ironically, the parcels business is now the darling of postal administrations worldwide. For many years, I have been fascinated by the variety in and the intricacies of parcel post. As generally larger items, often franked with high denomination stamps, they are visually engaging. But like Hans Christian Andersen's Ugly Duckling, they tend to be little understood and generally unloved. Today, I'm concentrating on one small aspect of parcel post. Between 1946 and 1949, individual Australians and businesses contributed mightily to the welfare of families in what was still, to most, from where they had come, Great Britain. Literally millions of gift packages of non-perishable foodstuffs were shipped to the old country, where the population was experiencing often stringent rationing of petroleum products, clothing, and most importantly, food. They weren't starving, but they were doing it tough. I first visited England in the mid-1980s and the food was still appalling. The situation, glad to say it's improved in more recent times, largely as a result of the influx of people from all over Europe as the result of membership of the EU, which I guess is now changing. I expect the food's gone back to being terrible. No, not really. Where was I? The situation in the mid-1940s was, of course, the product of the privations of World War II, which raged from September 1939, or from 1936, if you consider Japan's invasion of China as the start of all of this, until September 1945 with the capitulation of Japan. For much of this time, civilian mails by both sea or air between Australia and Britain were interrupted and even suspended. In addition, trade routes through the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean largely ceased when Italy entered the war in June 1940, causing ships on the England-Australia run to detour via South Africa. That's some detour. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 resulted in chaos for merchant shipping in the Pacific Ocean. The fall of Singapore only 2 months later had similar impacts in the Indian Ocean. Before the war, almost all parcels, by virtue of their mass and weight, were consigned by sea. Letter rates applied to parcels sent by air, making them prohibitively expensive for most people. Wartime conditions resulted in most civilian shipping and aircraft being commandeered for military purposes. Movement of freight was controlled by governments. There was little interest in facilitating private consignments and little, if any, space for such sendings. Consequently, for almost 5 years, the carriage of parcels between Britain and Australia dwindled to a trickle. Even after hostilities ended, which in Europe was in May 1945, it took several years for commercial shipping to return to normal operating conditions. Thousands of ships had been lost and needed to be replaced. Before commandeered ships could be returned to the merchant marine, millions of servicemen needed to be sent home. Prisoners of war and internees put similar pressure on the system in the opposite direction. This was the intense situation into which the Food for Britain scheme was launched in Australia. Many people had petitioned the government to allow and then encourage them to send food to their friends and relatives in Blighty. I expect you're familiar with that term. Impetus for a formal scheme is generally credited to Melbourne businessman Norman Meyer, who was knighted for his promotion of the idea. Meyer had visited England in 1945 and returned home with harrowing tales of the plight of millions of Britons. With Meyer pushing the charitable agenda, the government got behind the idea and the formal scheme was launched early in 1946. No actual date has been noted. I hope this potted history is helpful in providing context for the postal artefacts you're about to see. This is a forerunner from 1930 during the Great Depression from the New South Wales country town of Murwillumbah. The information on the label tells us that the package contained nuts and nut butter, that the items weighed 4 pounds, a bit less than 2 kilograms, and had a value of 5 shillings. Okay, so sterling currency comprised pounds, not to be confused with pound weight, shillings and pence. There were 12 pennies or pence to the shilling and 20 shillings to the pound. Thus, there were 240 pennies to a pound. If it sounds complicated, it was. You Canadians are very fortunate to have gone decimal in 1858. We had to endure one of the craziest currencies in the world for another 108 years. If you have a quick run down the list, you'll see that both tuppence and threepence converted to 2 cents, and both ninepence and tenpence converted to 8 cents. So we managed to get to a shilling or 12 pence being worth 10 cents. And I can tell you, as somebody who grew up having to learn how to calculate in pre-decimal currency, it was a nightmare. Keeping things relatively simple, throughout the period being discussed, parcels to England needed to have a PP8 label affixed. This was a gummed customs declaration, as shown here. It is clear that stamps were not supposed to be affixed to this label. However, the vast majority to have survived are festooned with stamps. Unused forms, such as shown here, are rare, and this one is mint unhinged. And I feel unhinged just saying that. It is important to note that the parcel regulations were very strict. If not complied with, a parcel could be refused, confiscated, or even destroyed. Many were, and many others were pillaged in transit. Whoops, there we go. The PP8 form was usually pink, with all printing in black, but other colours were used, including red on green. These labels are a collecting field in themselves. Most have the government printer's record number at the base, down here, and this one at the lower right, stating it was printed in 1946. Some labels had a wide red stripe, the meaning of which has so far eluded me and the people who should know, who I've asked about it. This example was printed by a private company, identified at lower left as WF and Co. The customs declaration included space for an address that was often abbreviated to England or left blank. The address was written in full on the package wrapping. Many commercial firms introduced printed address labels, this one from a department store in Adelaide, South Australia. This is the earliest wartime parcel item in my collection, and the only one charged the 3 and 4p rate up to £7 weight. It is expected that this was a food package, but it may have been other merchandise. A challenge for anyone collecting parcel items is that postmarks are often poorly struck because of the bulky and irregular contents. A magnifier reveals that this item was posted in September 1945. Unfortunately, the day is illegible, making it my earliest end-of-war usage. It's also the only one seen from a country store in Western Australia. Most unusually, it is fashioned from a standard envelope on which lots of detail has been typed. The holes at the top and at the base are from the envelope being stitched onto the parcel wrapping, which was commonly made of calico. I have no idea what calico is, but I understand it's a fairly low-grade cloth. Postage rates for Food for Britain parcels were the same as for other packages. The 3-tier rate structure was introduced in 1941. The first step was 1 and 11p for small parcels weighing up to £3. This is the only example I have located, and believe me, I've been looking. The second step for parcels weighing between £3 and £7 was 3 shillings and 7p, and this is the most common rate that you'll see. Examples such as this are relatively common, but this item was declared to weigh more than £7, 8 ounces or 7.5 pounds, there being 16 ounces in a pound, for which the rate was 5 and 10p. The short payment may not have been detected. If it was, the recipient would have been charged double the 2 and 3p deficiency. Postman to housewife: "It's your lucky day, love. Here's a food parcel. That'll be 4 and 6, tar." Hope you've seen some English humour shows and understand what I just said. As just noted, the third tier was parcels weighing between 7 and 11 pounds, which is less than 5 kilograms, which was the maximum weight accepted for parcels, for which the postage was 5 and 10p. So you can see we've got 2 shillings, 2 shillings, 1 and 6p, and 4p to make up the 5 and 10. By comparison, similar care parcels from the United States could weigh 3 times as much as here. This one, gross weight of 30 pounds. Why is that the case? Well, it's complicated and it has a lot to do with bureaucracy. Because of the sheer volume of orders for food parcels, Sydney Meyer's firm, the Meyer Emporium, I've said earlier Norman Meyer, but Sydney Meyer was the founder and he was Norman's dad. The Meyer Emporium requested the post office to provide them with pre-stamped postage on their gummed gift parcel address blanks. Only 3 and 7p and 5 and 10p embossings were provided, there being little demand for the 1 and 11p rate. The 3 and 7p labels are very scarce, with only 2 unused examples being known. This label is unusual because the gift giver was from Singapore. Am I looking at the right one here? Not sure I'm on the right stuff. It doesn't matter. So this is a rarely seen usage of a 3 and 7p label uprated to 5 and 10p with additional stamps. The recipient was Colonel Harry Evans, who was London agent for the giant mining company BHP. I sold his magnificent collection more than 20 years ago, but I acquired this item only in 2022, and I don't think it was in his collection, so how it came onto the market is a bit of a mystery. You'll perhaps realise that this label has been truncated. The sender's details at the base have been removed. Most unfortunate. So there's a full-size label. The 3 and 7... what am I doing here? Oh, this has got out of order. This is the previous one that I said was from the person in Singapore. My apologies for that. Thought I'd check them. Okay, the 3 and 7p label for Fitzgerald's store in Hobart was discovered only in 2004. My colleague Torsten Weller, who some of you know, was offered an Australian stamp collection at a show in Christchurch, New Zealand, and this label was the only decent thing in it and was completely unrecognised by the vendor. A second example was believed to exist in Neil Russell's collection, but it turned out to be a colour photocopy of this piece. So as far as we know, this is the only example in captivity. The most regularly encountered of the embossed labels is the 5 and 10p for the Myer Emporium in Melbourne. There are at least 2 printings in different shades of blue. A missing colour error, known only from a single mint example, has all the text in red omitted. Obviously not postal history, but worth noting. I couldn't find it when I was putting this presentation together. I just chanced upon it yesterday. It was a bit late to include it. The Department of Agriculture for the state of Victoria is the only official agency that used embossed labels of the 5 and 10p value only. And they were for parcels prepared within the department. Used examples are very scarce. This one is from a member of the state's Legislative Council or Upper House of Parliament. Sydney department store Anthony Horden Limited was the only other user of the embossing facility, and again of only the 5 and 10p denomination. Usage must have been very limited because only 2 examples, both used, have been recorded. By 1948, the essence of the scheme had changed. Myer now sent bulk shipments of foodstuffs to England and posted address labels by air. Individual food parcels were assembled in England and the address labels are fixed along with British postage. I've never seen an example. I'd like to. Consequently, the number of food parcels actually sent from Australia plummeted. Myer still provided the facility, but when the stock of embossed labels was exhausted, they resorted to using franking machines to print metre impressions, as here, the 3 and 7p. And here, 5 and 10p. So these, this and the previous item are both from British expatriates living in India. 5 and 10p is the highest rate I have seen from an Australian franking machine. I generally don't pay much attention to them. I find them intrinsically, shall I say, boring, unless they have some advertising and a slogan or something like that. But every now and then one comes along that is something special, and this is certainly one of those. Okay, examples of printed gift parcel labels from states other than Victoria are very elusive. This example is from the Queensland department store Barry and Roberts. Again, you'll see it's franked 5 and 10p, and it has a little hand stamp here that says gift parcel. This parcel label is from Tasmania, which is our smallest and least populous state, and just about any collecting element that affects all of Australia, you'll find that items from Tasmania are generally scarcer than from any other part of the country, and certainly the case here. Sanatorium Health Food Company, you may be familiar with it in Canada, I'm not sure, but here and in America, it's a commercial operation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and is still operating. This is my most recent acquisition for this collection, a printed card enclosed in parcels sent by Elphinstons, a Queensland firm for whom I haven't cited a single food parcel label and about whom I know next to nothing. But it came in just in time to be included in this presentation. To this point, there had been no post-war changes to parcel rates. In fact, the only published reference states that rates were increased only on the 9th of July 1951. However, the empirical evidence is that there were minor increases by mid-1948, even though the rates published in the official 1949 and 1950 post office guides remained unchanged. This label is dated the 13th of October 1948, you can actually read it clearly, is rated 4 and a penny for a £7 parcel, reflecting an increase of 6p. So 3 and 7p to 4 shillings is 5p plus 5p plus another penny. This is one of my favourites, being one of the most attractive labels from a food parcel. It is franked with the 1 and 4p King George VI magenta, which I think is Australia's prettiest stamp, and a 5 shilling robes on thin paper, which is the second issue of the robes, which is a rare stamp on cover. I actually have 3 examples on parcel labels, and I don't think I've seen another one on a commercially used item going overseas. The rubber date stamp in violet ink is the cherry on the top, and it shows that it's from the post office at West Maitland in New South Wales, which is in the Hunter Valley, north of Sydney. The rate has now risen from 5 and 10p to 6 and 4p, and again an advance of 6p. And importantly, the rate is confirmed as being between 7 and 11 pounds. So the weight here is given as 10 pounds, 3 ounces. And the value, £1, 5 shillings. It's a lot of money back then. The formal Food for Britain campaign ended in 1949. Of course, private citizens could still send food parcels, but from 9th of July, 1951, at much higher cost. From that date, postage for a £7 parcel, previously 3 and 7, and then 4 and a penny, soared all the way to 10 and 2p, a massive 60% increase. But what to make of this example? No, not that one, this one. The parcel weighed between 7 and 11 pounds. It said 7 pounds, 8 ounces, but it has been rated 9 and 3p. At the time, the highest rate was 5 and 10p. So this is a real head scratcher. It can't have been sent by air because it just doesn't make sense. There's not enough postage on it for an item of that weight to have been sent by airmail. So I'm open to suggestions. Yeah, I've really tried to work it out, but without success. Now we move into the home straight with a few very special items. This label is hand-stamped Naval Service, and postage of only 1 shilling and 3p has been paid. On the 18th of December 1939, so very early in the war, a 6-tier concessional rate structure for the armed forces was introduced. 1 and 3p was the rate for a parcel weighing between 3 and 5 pounds. So here we've got a 4 pound weight. There must have been hundreds of thousands of parcels sent to soldiers, sailors and airmen, but this is the only example I've encountered. And this is the only insured food parcel I've come across. Dated October 1947, the rate was still 5 and 10p, to which the minimum insurance fee of 6p was added. along with two related labels. So this one says insured, and then French valeur déclarée. And then we have the Australian Postmaster General's Department insured parcel label over here. Both of these labels are very scarce on any type of article. It's interesting that the sixpence, which was the minimum amount for insurance, actually provided up to £12 value in cover. But in this instance, the declared value was only £1 10 shillings, or 30 shillings, if you like. Okay. So here we have a 1946 parcel rated 3 and 7pence. Very scarce franking of the sixpence block of 6. Unfortunately, it's taken out of the top of the upper right stamp. But the interesting thing about this one is the little white label from Perth, a PP2. This is a official designation in the regulations. But these labels were supposed to be used only on domestic parcels. The only example I've seen on an overseas one. This address label from Farmer and Company, trust me, it's under there, has the type date 5/11/41 and is correctly rated 3 and 7pence for up to £7 weight. Had it been overweight, the short payment would have been 2 and 3pence and the postage due double that amount, or 4 and 6pence, or more than the cost of sending the parcel in the first place. However, only 1 and 3pence was charged on arrival, suggesting that this was for a customs fee. And I've included this one for Ken, of course. This is another oddity, again from farmers, and you can see that on their private parcel post label. I've seen 3 labels on this parcel, but I've seen nowhere else. And you might be forgiven for thinking the whole thing is a bit of a philatelic setup, but it rates out 6 and 10pence. If you add up all these 7pence halfpennies and these 2pence halfpennies, it shows it to be from later than the 9th of July 1951 for a £7 parcel. The 7pence halfpenny George VI stamp was issued on the 31st of October 1951. So that conforms with the rate information. As noted earlier, parcels could be arranged to be sent on behalf of people living in other countries. In this instance, the sender was from Nooraliya in the temperate Ceylon Highlands. Ceylon is another of my collecting interests. I collect World War II, postal history, and postcards from there because that's where my wife is from. Okay. Not all parcels from this era contained food, and that should be self-evident. In this instance, the label advises that the package contained a sheepskin and that it was a free gift, which of course is something of a woolly-headed tautology. And not all food parcels were sent to Britain. This example from 1948, both of the 1 and 3pence and 5 shilling thin paper being issued in that year, is to that part of Germany that was occupied by the Americans, USA Zone IN. Up to this time, rates to foreign countries were routinely higher than to empire destinations. In this case, 9 and 2pence instead of 5 and 10pence was required to send an £11 parcel into Europe. Now to the largest item in the collection, which has been significantly reduced to fit on the landscape slide. It's clearly dated the 1st of September 1948. It's also to Germany, also at the 9 and 2pence rate. I said earlier the 5 and 7pence metre was the highest I'd seen. Look at that, of course, it's 9 and 2pence. I'll need to revisit that one. This one is going to the Russian occupied zone in Germany. And this one's a bit of a treasure. Almost finally, which I know is an oxymoron. Here is a label dated the 9th of November 1948 to Sarawak, rated 6 and 3pence for up to £7. This isn't just an exotic destination. It's the only recorded parcel to any part of the Malayan region. I had food parcel in my notes, but I was talking to somebody the other day and he said, well, we don't know of anything else going to into Borneo. So that makes it a very special item. And in fact, the Sarawak Study Circle thought so highly of this item that they put it on the front of their journal. And it probably explains why I had to pay over $1,100 to buy it.
Wow.
Often the most difficult element of a display or exhibit is deciding how to wrap up the ending thoughtfully and appropriately. Throughout this presentation, I've talked almost exclusively about the processes in and from Australia and about the senders. It seems appropriate to conclude with a letter of thanks from the recipient of multiple food parcels. The writer was a well-known musician and author named Dr. Thomas Wood. He wrote to a friend in Brisbane who passed the letter to the Brisbane Courier Mail newspaper. The letter is full of gratitude, including this gem. There is enough to eat, but it is dullish, and the gift parcels do make a big difference. Before finishing up, I must acknowledge two philatelic friends. Firstly, Richard Brecken, who some of you may have come across from his numerous writings in various journals. Richard is my go-to guy for anything to do with postal services and rates. He's worked in the Australian Post Office I think his entire working life, and he's older than me. I hope he doesn't retire because then I might lose access to information. Purely selfish. Richard published a series of articles about Australian postal rates in the mid-1980s, and he has been promising, at my urging, for 4 decades to produce a book on the subject. I've offered him all the illustrations he could need for what I collect, but still hasn't happened. So if you're listening, Richard, there's another little nudge. The late Neil Russell from England was a great friend of mine and my business. Many of the gems in my collection formerly reposed in Neil's albums. When he asked me to sell his parcel labels, I was excited at the prospect of acquiring a few pieces. As it turned out, amazingly, I was the only bidder for most of this fascinating and historically important material. So Neil's presence is all over this display. I hope I've encouraged you to look more closely at the historical and social context of your own material. Remember, every cover and even every stamp has a story to tell. And by revealing those stories and making them interesting to others, we make our hobby more accessible to people who might want to join our ranks. And I thank you all most sincerely for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions. Any questions from anybody?
Yep, it's Neil Donan here. So
Hi,
Neil. I noticed that a number of the parcels were taxed. Was that a common problem?
I think only I showed only one, I think it was taxed.
There were two.
Two, were there? Okay.
Yeah.
No, I don't think it was a common problem. And as I said, I remember saying in respect of one of them, I'm pretty sure that it was a customs charge rather than a postal charge. The post office in Australia, and I expect it was the same in Canada and just about all countries at the time, the clerks were well trained. Can't say that today. They knew the regulations backwards. The parcels obviously had to be handed over the counter. And so it would be very unlikely that a parcel would be allowed to slip through with inadequate postage on it. Oh, I know the second one that you're referring to, the one that wasn't taxed but probably should have been. And of course, the evidence of that may have been on the parcel itself.
Yes.
This, of course, is one of the challenges of collecting parcels. You usually don't have the entire article, and that can make for some interesting challenges and sometimes the necessity to create a scenario that at least sort of fits what you're doing. Don't tell the judges I said that.
Thank you.
Gary,
Have you,
Gary,
go ahead, David.
David Foote here. Were there
Hi,
any
David.
Hi, were there any, and I enjoyed the presentation, thank you very much.
Thank
Were
you.
there any foodstuffs that were prohibited?
Yes, they all had to be non-perishable. So dairy products and fruit and meat and things like that were just banned. So virtually everything was dry foods or in tins. You could send fruit that was in tins, for instance. But a lot of them included things like Christmas cakes from the good old days when they lasted for years, like wedding cakes of the year. And there was a lot of pretty basic stuff included. Dried fruit was a very popular one. If it was packaged properly, it would last. And stock cubes was a favourite. But there's as many items as could be sent. There were probably 10 that couldn't. And so it was fairly restricted and based largely on the fact that it took probably 6 weeks in most cases for the parcels to even get to England. That situation probably changed with the bulk shipments from Myer. They were probably able to include other things that were refrigerated and so on, but I don't have any information about that element of the scheme, so I'm only guessing.
What about jars and glass?
Jars? They could be if they were properly packaged so that they were unlikely to get broken. But obviously, if something like that broke in transit and leaked through the parcel wrapping or something along those lines, it was liable to be destroyed. So people would have been urged to send tins rather than glassware.
I was going to ask the exact same question there, David. So we're thinking like
ask me something else, Michelle. Ask me how many food parcel labels have B overprints on them.
I was thinking, how many was there? The parcels were sent only by ship.
Yes.
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 And did they put? Go ahead.
No, go on. What were you saying?
Well, seeing the food prices in Britain, did they put special ships in place to, at least near the beginning, to really rush the parcels so the Brits would not have to take another notch off their belt?
The problem is logistical. With the end of the war, things didn't return to normality anytime soon. For instance, the rationing in Britain continued until 1954. Meat was the last thing to go off the rationing list. But at the end of the war, there was just so much chaos. Ships had to be rebuilt, had to be repurposed, new ships had to be built. And of course, the movement of refugees, POWs, displaced persons of all nature, they were having to be shipped all over the place from where they had been temporarily housed to back to where they were from, or in some cases to other third-party countries. And all those things took priority over movement of any sort of cargo. And so in that early period after the war, through late 45 into 1947, the amount of parcel traffic and the amount of any commercial sendings was very low because there just wasn't the storage or the space available for taking them. And that's why it took until 1948 for the scheme to be introduced, because prior to that, it would have resulted in a huge amount of material just building up at the wharves around Australia and there being no ships to send it in.
Could 4th class mail be registered?
Yeah, yes, it could. Oh, yes, you could definitely send parcels registered. And that's a good pickup that I don't have one. But yes, that could certainly be done. And when you consider that at the time, the registration fee was still only 3pence, as it had been since 1891, that's quite a remarkable thing. In fact, when they finally put the registration rate up, which I think was in 1951, it doubled to 6pence.
Yeah.
So But that fee from 1891 to 1951, 60 years unchanged. That's pretty impressive. It wouldn't happen these days.
Yeah, I might not have been listening well enough, but did they get a break on food parcel, the cost of sending food parcels as opposed to sending other parcels?
The rates were exactly the same, Michelle, but the forces rates were significantly reduced. And whereas the civilian rates were a 3-band setup, for the forces it was 6 different rates, again with a maximum weight of 11 pounds. But yeah, find me some forces ones. I'll be very happy.
There was a question of what is calico? What kind of fabric? We would call it muslin.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's probably in the same class, low grade. That I
Unbleached
believe
cotton,
very
my wife said.
porous. I'm sorry, what was that, Greg?
Unbleached cotton.
Yeah, that sounds good. We'll go with that.
What's the best source for these? What I'm thinking of is that, these labels were used to send to the UK. So I gather if you want used ones, you have to be looking around the UK.
Yes, well, as I said at the end, a high proportion of the items in this collection are from Neil Russell, who was an English collector. And who had a fantastic collection. He did both directions. There was all sorts of ephemera that was produced in England relating to the scheme, advising people of what was going on and if they got a parcel, what they should do by way of acknowledgement and so on. And apart from Neil's collection, the labels generally, they're elusive. As a class, but they do turn up regularly. And enough of them have filtered back to Australia over the years that you probably find more of them here than anywhere else now. But the postal stationery labels, the embossed ones, I expect that virtually all of them came back to Australia at one point and but have been dispersed to collectors all around the world at different times. But yeah, it's one of those things where if you're in England, it's the sort of thing you could expect to find with better postal history dealers, of whom a few remain.
Hello, Gary. This is Andrew.
Hello, Andrew.
You mentioned a parcel that was overpaid. Could that be because it contained perhaps personal correspondence requiring additional postage?
Look, thanks for the question. I don't think that's the case because you had the weight limit. The weight limit was 11 pounds, regardless of what was in the package.
Yes.
So the size apparently didn't matter. I mean, you could send 11 pounds of duck feather and it would be enormous. But there was this restriction on the weight, and that weight restriction was in place from when parcel service to England began in the 1880s, and never changed. And I think the main reason it didn't change was a reluctance on the part of the British Post Office to accept heavier articles. I've seen a reference to that somewhere, that the sticking point was in London rather than in Canberra. Oh, and by the way, Andrew, thank you for your assistance in getting me to this point today.
Oh, no, thank you for your time. The reason I asked this question about personal correspondence inside parcels, that in Canada, if you include personal correspondence in a parcel, you're required to pay the letter mail rate in addition to the parcel rate because it contains a personal letter or something of a personal nature.
All right. Well, that's an interesting thing. Yeah, I'll look into that. That's
just wondering.
That's certainly an interesting spin on it. Letter rate, still surface mail. I don't think it would work out on the weight.
No way.
That was my conclusion when I looked at whether it might have been sent by air. It just couldn't be because the amount of postage required would have been far higher. And if you're looking at letter rate, that's that's very much. Look, you might be onto something there. I'll certainly look into that.
Just curious.
Thank you for the suggestion. That's very good.
Thank you.
It's always good talking with postal historians because they get it.
That
very,
the charge for the personal letter in a parcel is still the case in France. They have a book rate, and if you put any personal correspondence or anything in it, and they do check it, that's still the case. That it has to go at a parcel rate and not the book post.
Well, they're lucky that they have a book post. We haven't
They
had
are.
book posts for years, and it's such a drag. And it's one of the reasons why the trade in philatelic literature is a very difficult area these days, because you have to pay regular rates to send stuff. And these days, and I expect it's the same in Canada, we have very few countries that any surface mail is sent to. Even from New Zealand, everything comes by air. That's a nice little rort, isn't it, for the post office?
Were there charities who one of their jobs was to send parcels? So there would be, going out a certain number of parcels from whatever charity.
I haven't seen any evidence of parcels going directly from the charities, but I know that the Red Cross and the Boy Scouts were involved in packaging at Myer. So it was a huge operation at the height before Myer started shipping foodstuffs in bulk, and they needed lots of hands to help package the parcels. And I've seen photographs of Scout troops and Red Cross auxiliary staff, usually ladies, packing boxes in huge warehouses. So it was certainly a huge logistical situation. And I expect that charitable organisations were involved in other parts of Australia as well, and probably far more than the two that I know of.
But the second part of this is that in Canada, we had cigarette packages would be sent to soldiers. And then once they got it, there was a card included where they would sign it, say, thank you very much, and that sort of thing. And then it would go back to the charity that sent it. So I was wondering if there were charities, maybe something like that existed. People are spending a lot of money to send you something. If it's a family friend, well, you send them a letter, but if it's a charity, then you might send them an enclosed card.
Yeah, I've never seen any. I'm well aware of the tobacco funds that operated, particularly in World War One, and that situation occurred with Australian forces as well. And I expect right through the British Empire. But with the food parcels, I'm not aware of a reply card being inserted, and I've certainly never seen one that's come back. That little card from the Brisbane firm that said, here's a parcel, hope it eases your suffering, something along those lines. If the parcel's included a little guilting like that, then I expect that letters of thanks were forthcoming. And of course, all the labels, not so much the customs labels, but certainly the address labels had the details of the sender. And as I showed in a number of cases, the senders were from overseas. So people knew who had sent, who was responsible for sending the parcels, and to whom they should write with their thanks. And that one newspaper article that I showed, that's fairly typical. There were newspapers all around the country that published letters like that people had received from people in Britain to whom they'd sent food parcels. And I'm sure that there was an overwhelming sense of gratitude about the whole thing, because if your diet was boiled potatoes and mutton, and you suddenly got a nice fruit cake and a can of peaches, that would light up the entire family's life for a week or more.
Thank you.
Any further comments or questions for Gary?
Well, in that case, as the thank you person for the Pssc, Gary, thank you very much for leading down a path that very few of us have followed, and from the other part of the world too, which is great to see you here. May there be many more of these things on the market for you, so you can come back in a year or two and give us an update. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. Thank you all.